Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, Ukraine is calling for stronger American leadership as diplomacy with Russia remains stalled, while simultaneously pushing Europe to take greater responsibility for the security architecture surrounding any future settlement. Germany is increasingly central to that effort, combining military assistance, air defense, economic support, and diplomacy. Joining us today on TVP World to assess whether this emerging transatlantic strategy can deliver a durable peace is Professor Andrew Michta, a senior fellow and the director of the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative, specialist in NATO, Germany, Central Europe, and transatlantic security. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So Ukraine does say that negotiations with Russia are effectively on hold as Moscow is reluctant to show any interest in any substantial diplomacy. What have to change before Kremlin decides that serious negotiation is more preferable to continuing the war?
As long as Putin believes that he can actually achieve his goals by continued military pressure, I think negotiations will largely be secondary in terms of his priorities. If you look at the situation in Ukraine, the winter is coming. The Russians have significantly increased the number of attacks at Ukrainian facilities, especially attacking energy grid and civilian targets. I believe that Putin is convinced that considering the paucity of interceptors, you know about the shortage of Patriot missiles that need to be used to stop Russian missiles coming in. He believes that time is on his side. So until he gets a sense that he cannot achieve his objectives through military means and military pressure, I think he will be looking at negotiations as his second option, not his primary option.
Right. Now, Kyiv is explicitly asking for stronger American leadership, and that brings us to the question, what leverage can Washington realistically bring onto the negotiating table that Europe even collectively cannot?
Well, Washington remains the principal supplier of high-end weapons, intel, sensors, everything that Ukraine needs for deep strikes inside Russia, attacking their refineries, for example. Washington is also key when it comes to where the principal weapon systems come from. So even if Europeans are putting money to purchase those weapons and munitions, they need to come from American stockpiles. The problem is, as you know, we're now also committed to the Gulf in the ongoing war with Iran, and that draws attention from Washington in that direction. So the United States could put more pressure on Russia and, quite frankly, put pressure on China and Iran, who play a very important role in sustaining Putin's regime. Without the Chinese economic support components and without Iranian technology, especially when you look at the drones, Russia would be in a very tough spot. So it's a question of attention and whether or not the United States wants to pull some restrictions that are still in place.
Right. In the meantime, it does seem like Europe is stepping up with this additional security architecture as well. Now, Germany is increasingly moving from supporting Ukraine during the war towards helping shape what comes afterwards as well. Do you see Berlin positioning itself to become a major security guarantor?
Definitely, Berlin is positioning itself to become the major economic partner for Ukraine and the major participant when it comes to post-war reconstruction, should we get to that stage. It's also with the visit by Minister Wadepool, it's signaling that it will continue to lead within Europe. This is happening just shortly before the next Coalition of the Willing meeting to increase support for Ukraine, just before Germany, France, and Britain are due to co-chair another meeting of that group, that Germany is in the leadership position here. The real problem, however, is that even if Europe continues to provide finance, it lacks the defense industrial base sufficient to actually produce weapons and munitions at speed and scale, and lacks systems for which only the United States is the sole source. So it's an important political signal. Wadepool flew there just a couple of days before the Ukrainian Independence Day, which is August 24th, and also flew there despite the fact that the Russians have increased attacks against Ukrainian targets. But by and large, yes, Europe can provide finance, but the devil is in the details. Ukrainians can't shoot Euros. They need weapons, munitions, and equipment. And that's where we need strong American engagement.
Right, now going back to what you mentioned earlier with the dwindling stockpile of the air defense systems, it has become a central priority with Russians continuing to target Ukrainian cities with ballistic missiles and such. How directly does Ukraine's ability to intercept these air attacks determine its position if there's any eventual negotiation?
Well, it's a very complicated situation. Ukraine has done remarkably well developing in-house means to both counter electromagnetically and to use their own home-developed systems, building their own drones. So in here, Ukraine can continue to be largely quasi-independent. Still needs to get components, but they're not that difficult to get. The problem is, again, the high end, Caliber missiles, Russian high-end systems, all of that requires the technology that right now no other system besides the Patriot batteries can actually address. And here the shortage is very significant because it opens up a possibility for the Russians to cause more damage, if you will, to the energy infrastructure. Winters in Ukraine are very tough. Energy grid is critical to the survival of Ukraine. So this is a major, major problem. President Trump briefly spoke about maybe giving license to Ukraine to produce the PAC-3 version of the missile. That has been pulled back for security reasons. So this will remain a problem. Europe doesn't have anything that's equivalent to the PAC-3 Patriot effector that it can provide Ukraine. A big problem.
All right, like I mentioned earlier, Ukraine still needs this weapon ammunitions, and I really like when you mentioned how they can't just shoot Euros. So it is fine and good that the Europeans are helping with financially, but with the coalition of the willing, for example, discussing security guarantees for Ukraine, what can these coalitions or can Europe genuinely do to deter another Russian attack that amounts to more than just political signaling?
You need to see this in a larger context of what happened over the last 20 years. I mean, what you've seen has been appeasement on the part of Europe when it came to Russian aggression. 2008, the Russians took Georgia. 2014, Crimea. 2015, they butchered Syrians at Aleppo. Every single time, they virtually paid no price for it and scored geopolitical wins. And only in 2022, when President Biden said no more, Europe, NATO, and the collective West aligned. But it is still not on the same page if you look at European players when it comes to the nature of the threat. There's a regionalized security optics in Europe. Those countries that are on the flank, from Scandinavia down Finland, Baltic states, Poland, they see the urgency of the threat. Things change as you travel west. So Germany has buffers to the east. France is preoccupied with the Mediterranean, and Spain is struggling with migration. This is one of the biggest problems that we have. Europe has not yet decided, and I speak here about European leadership, to speak directly to their citizenry and to communicate to them how grave the situation has become. And that means that it's very constrained in what it can provide for the Ukrainians besides monetary and political support.
All right. This is also very apparent when we see how, be it Europe, the Baltic states, they don't necessarily see Russia or even the terms of acceptable peace exactly the same way. Now, so how serious are these differences inside Europe? And do you think that this is going to drag this carriage in too many different directions to have a coherent message going forward?
Alliances are built through shared interests from which grow shared threats from which there grow shared national interests. And the countries on the flank, I mean, if you live in Estonia or in Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland, Russian threat is existential. The small countries, the Baltic Republic, in the event they were overrun, they're risking not only their sovereignty, they actually risk the very existence as nations. It's very different when you move farther away from the theater. It is a very different situation from what you had during the Cold War, where the threat perception against the Soviet bloc unified the entire continent. So this is where we see the problem. The second thing that's worth mentioning, even though Europe is stepping up and there's a lot of rhetorical support for Ukraine these days, Europe has neglected weapons and munitions and militaries for the last 30 years, taking a vacation from history to a point that it will take Europe itself, with very few exceptions. Finland is a notable exception. Poland is a notable exception. Very long time, probably up to a decade, to rebuild the militaries that they need to have to deter Russia. So even though Russia is relatively weaker compared to where the Soviet Union was, the threat is actually much greater. And Ukraine here finds itself between those conflicting demands of what those nations need for their own defense and what Ukraine should receive to continue fighting.
All right, speaking of rhetoric versus action, we've seen Europe try to take action through things like sanctions, frozen Russian assets, and even continued military support, which is being treated as an instrument to bringing Moscow towards negotiations. But do you think that the West is applying enough pressure to change Russia's strategic calculation? Do you think there are any other levers that Europe can still pull?
Of course, Europe is not doing enough. The collective West is not doing enough. If you remember the debate about actually seizing the Russian bank assets, the assets that find themselves in the West, and the differences you saw among various European players. The same goes for the extent to which the actual military presence and the risk that is associated with that in Ukraine would be provided by the European nations. That is also very much in contention. Most importantly, I found it striking. I just spent 3 months in Europe, and I cannot tell you how many Russian tourists I ran into. So obviously they're getting Schengen visas. They're continuing to do business with Europe, despite all the high-minded rhetoric. If you really want to isolate a country, you don't go that route. You put very hard, strong walls against that. And most of all, we've had multiple cases where the airspace has been breached, where there have been terror attacks inside European NATO perimeter, and the response has been inadequate. I mean, we had a case not so long ago where 3 Russian jets were hanging very close to Tallinn, the Estonian capital. And instead of shooting those jets, we simply escorted them. And then Secretary Rutte said that that is actually a show of Western strength. I disagree. I think for the Russians, that's a show of weakness and indecision on our part.
Right, definitely very, very alarming indeed. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.